and avoid the deepest, most draconian cuts or services, or the larger tax increases that would have been needed if we had chosen not to cut those services. So the federal stimulus was a great help over 2 years. We now do not have that. We also do not have a rainy day fund that is large enough at the present time to be able to take care of the entire budget deficit. We have north of $600 million in the rainy day fund right now. We know we will be able to draw on that somewhat, but if we go much below $300 million, it will start to affect the Commonwealth's ability to borrow for capital projects, important projects for economic development like the arts or like the Science Center at MCLA, like rehabs at Berkshire Community College, and any number of other important capital projects out here. So yes, this is the tough year because we don't have the assistance from the federal government, because we've drawn down just about as far as we can go on our rainy day fund, and because in prior years we've raised taxes north of $1 billion.
And at one point, not too long ago, that rainy day fund was over $2.5 billion, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. And unlike we are in far better shape now than many of the states that didn't have a rainy day fund going into this budget cycle. Let me also say this, considering what's going on in a lot of other states, the good thing about the budget deliberations in Massachusetts, and I think largely because we have tried to take these problems head on over the past couple of years, and we've known that this would be a difficult year, that you don't see the type of blaming and demagoguing going on in states, trying to blame the people who help provide the services, be they teachers, firefighters, whoever it is. We are working with our state employees to make sure that everyone is sharing in the sacrifice, but also that we're respecting the people who provide those services while we do it, knowing full well that we're in this together, and that if we want to provide these services, we need to respect the people who do that as well.
I think that's an important point, that as difficult as these times are, they could be much worse, as we're seeing in other states. And as difficult as these times are, we must work together and not be going at each other, because that will not help. The $145 million increase in revenues, what is that coming from? Is there one or two specific things, or why are we seeing that?
Well, no, I think we are seeing that because the economy of Massachusetts is finally starting to grow. So last month, despite the high-profile news around Fidelity and even Evergreen Solar, Massachusetts created over 15,000 jobs. And then if you saw federally, we created well over 200,000 jobs. So I think you're starting to see the revenue increases that we would associate with increased economic activity. So we're starting to see an uptick in withholding. We're starting to see an uptick in income tax. We're starting to see an uptick in just about every revenue source that we base our budget on. So I think for the most part, it's generally increased economic activity. Now, if you don't have a job, then that increased economic activity doesn't mean anything to you unless you're on unemployment right now. And you want to continue to remain on unemployment while you look for work. The increased economic activity gives us the revenue to be able to support that. So for the most part, the revenues above benchmark are reflective of generally increased economic activity. Quite frankly, we would be further above benchmark if it were not for still very high caseloads when it comes to unemployment, when it comes to the Medicaid program, Mass Health, and other income-eligible programs. With the amount of people that we have out of work, it drives more people to those programs. So just when state government has the least ability to provide a lot of those things, we have more people seeking it. And I think that's why it's incumbent on us to reform state government where we can, and to be smart about cuts that are proposed to balance the budget. Because to simply cut blindly doesn't solve a problem, and it doesn't reflect the fact that those programs are there for a reason, and that in many cases people need them, depend on them, and we need to find a way to provide them.
Now, I believe it was last November that in addition to the alcohol tax, which that was passed, so that tax has been eliminated, there was also on the ballot an attempt to reduce the state income tax, which did not succeed. And in your opinion, where would we be now if that had succeeded and the state income tax was reduced by, was it 1.5%?
Well, this was last year. You had both the alcohol taxes. You're right. The sales tax on alcohol was taken away. So that was $125 million that we had to come up with in the budget. And then you had the sales tax would have gone from 6.25. As you'll remember, we raised it from 5 to 6.25%. And then there was a proposal to cut it from 6.25 all the way down to 3. Right now, we would be without well over $2 billion that we're counting on in this budget this year. So I can't even begin to imagine how deep some of the proposed cuts would be and what type of scenarios we would be discussing at this point. It would have been a far different picture. I think, unfortunately, it would have been very similar to some of the messy debates that you've seen in other states at this point, because there would have been no easy answer to it. So I'm thankful that the voters in Massachusetts were wise enough to defeat what really was a radical proposal at that point. That being said, I think there is a good argument to be had here at the state level and certainly at the federal level about reforming our tax code, especially looking at a lot of the economic development incentives that we've put in place so that we get more transparency and we also have stronger clawback provisions so that if a company receives a benefit from the Commonwealth's taxpayers through the tax code, that they have to account for that. And if they don't meet the goals or their stated objectives of that tax incentive, that we be able to pull back the money that they were granted, or that they have to pay the taxes that they didn't have to pay under that. I think there's a lot we can do when it comes to tax reform, to creating a better environment for growth, and at the same point having a more equitable tax system.
And all of that makes sense. And I remember last November, and it seems every November, every other November, when something like that's on the ballot, they'll talk about the fact that there's waste in government. And I think we would all agree that there is some waste. But to slash a sales tax by that amount, while it might help an individual because they can see, if they're buying a TV or buying a large item, they're paying less dollars, the collective harm, as you said, is tremendous. And it's good that the voters were wise enough to see that last November. And hopefully if something like that's on the ballot, whether it's this year or next year, it'll be on again. Hopefully they'll see through it and recognize that it's not for the common good to cut those types of taxes like that. So we've got this $149 million. What happens to that? Does that go back into the budget for the coming year? Does it go into a supplemental budget for the current year?
No, I don't think it'll go into a supplemental. Okay. I think we'll be aware of that as we put together our budget. In the legislature, I think the House is aware of that as they try and determine not only what to put in the Ways and Means budget, but also what amendments should and shouldn't be accepted on the floor. And I'm sure that we will take into account the April revenues that come in as we put our budget together in May. So I think it's just something to be aware of, sort of wiggle room for us to have as we try and figure out where we want to put more money. And where we believe we can find some efficiencies and maybe even cut spending. So I think it's just something to be aware of as we get into the deliberations between the two bodies in the administration.
In other words, let's not spend it just yet.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Okay. Let's move on and talk about the 2010 census. We're starting to get the numbers in a way that we can look at them, or the numbers have been, and now we're starting to get the results. And the analysis. Here in Massachusetts, we have increased our population. Here in Berkshire County, we have a decrease based on the 2010 numbers. We knew that we had to have an increase in Massachusetts to avoid losing a congressional seat. Was the increase that we had here in Massachusetts enough to avoid doing that?
No. Population in Massachusetts grew about 3%, 3.1. We would have needed it to grow about 6%. To avoid losing a congressional seat. So currently we have 10 members of Congress. As of 2012, we will have 9. The redistricting committee, a joint committee of both the House and Senate, is currently holding a statewide tour, a listening tour, hearings throughout the state to hear from folks throughout the Commonwealth about what their priorities are when it comes to redistricting. We expect there to be a hearing in Pittsfield, more than likely early June. Potentially even June 11th has been the date that's been floated out there. And I will tell people if they are interested in testifying at that hearing or attending, please make sure to check my website. We'll be updating it. We'll make sure to send out email updates